Hallo, hier ist Chris am Tag 357.897 der aktuellen Corona-Pandemie. Live vom Podcaster Erlebnis Irland von unserer Terrasse. Umgeben von meinen lachenden Kids, die mich dauernd aus dem Konzept bringen. Schön, dich bei dieser Episode wieder zu hören. In der letzten Folge habe ich euch von meinem Besuch auf dem Glasnevin Cementery erzählt. Ich habe mich dort mit Marketing Managerin Anne Kilcoyne getroffen. Sie ist die Marketing Managerin des Friedhofsmuseums. Sie gab uns einen kurzen Überblick über die Geschichte und über die Arbeit des Museums, aber auch des Friedhofs. Im Anschluss sind wir dann mit Brigit, einer der Tourguides, auf Tour gegangen. Diese Tour möchte ich euch in dieser Episode präsentieren. Wir haben das jetzt nicht in der letzten Episode gemacht, sondern in einer Extra-Episode. Auf diesem Friedhof liegen viele bekannte Persönlichkeiten Dublins. Sie bilden einen Querschnitt durch die irische Geschichte und der irischen Gesellschaft. Also von daher gesehen kann man irrsinnig viel dort sehen, aber natürlich auch lernen. Im Vorfeld meines Besuchs habe ich eine Wunschliste zusammengestellt, welche Personen ich dort gerne heimsuchen würde, welche Gräber und Grabstätten ich gerne besuchen würde und über welche Menschen ich noch mehr erfahren würde. Auf ihr steht zum Beispiel Daniel O'Connell, den habe ich euch in der letzten Episode vorgestellt, ein Staatsmann, ein irischer Staatsmann, nach dem auch die O'Connell Street, Irlands, Dublins Hauptverkehrsstraße, Hauptgeschäftsstraße benannt ist. Brigit führt uns auch zum Grab von Roger Casement. Casement war ein britischer Diplomat, aber er stammte aus Irland. Im Ersten Weltkrieg versuchte er deshalb, irische Kriegsgefangene der britischen Armee im Deutschen Kaiserreich zu rekrutieren, um sie für den Unabhängigkeitskampf in Irland zu begeistern. Das hat aber nicht so ganz geklappt. Deshalb hat er sich dann darauf beschränkt, Unterstützung im Kaiserreich zu suchen und hat auch tatsächlich einen Waffentransport des Kaisers zugesagt bekommen. Aber die würden die Aufständischen nie erreichen, da es Probleme mit der Datumsabstimmung gab zwischen Casement und den Aufständischen. Darum scheiterte diese Waffenlieferung und das Schiff wurde von den Engländern, mit den Waffen wurde von den Engländern aufgebracht. Casement selber reiste mit einem deutschen U-Boot nach Irland und wurde bei seiner Ankunft dort dann von den Briten, von den Engländern verhaftet und wegen Hochverrat zum Tode verurteilt. Man muss sich vorstellen, Casement war ein englischer Diplomat, ein britischer Diplomat hohen Ranges, und das war natürlich dann schwierig für die Briten. Eine weitere Person, eine weitere Celebrity war Father Brown. Ich habe euch schon in einer der ersten Episoden über ihn berichtet. Er war Passagier an Bord der Titanic, und zwar vom englischen Liverpool bis ins irische Queenstown, heute Cove. Dort wurde er von einem reichen Mitreisenden eingeladen, mit nach New York zu kommen. Doch sein Vorgesetzter, ich glaube es war sogar sein Onkel, der Bischof, hat ihm das dann verboten und ihm indirekt somit das Leben gerettet. Als Fotograf konnte ich mir das natürlich dann nicht entgehen lassen, zu gucken, wo er begraben ist auf dem Glasnevin Friedhof. Von ihm, von Father Brown, stammen viele bekannte Fotografen bzw. Fotografien vom Bord der Titanic, also die wir heute oft in verschiedenen Büchern sehen. Zum Beispiel das eine Bild, wo ein Offizier auf dem Promenadendeck nach vorne zur Brücke läuft. Viele vermuten, es ist das letzte Bild von Captain Smith auf dem Weg zur Brücke. Auch das ist sehr bekannt und sehr oft in irgendwelchen Publikationen zu finden. Aber auch verschiedene andere Porträts oder auch vom Leben an Bord hat er festgehalten. Aber auch später im Ersten Weltkrieg war er auch sehr aktiv. Zum Beispiel als Kriegsgeistlicher war er oder Soldatenpfarrer war er dann auch unterwegs und hat dann auch Bilder gemacht. Seine Grabstätte zu finden war gar kein so einfaches Unterfangen, wie ihr in den nächsten Minuten hören werdet. Ein paar Funksprüche, ein paar Funkrufe später sind wir dann tatsächlich fündig geworden. Denn auf dem Glasnevin Cementery gibt es einen Platz, wo ausschließlich Geistliche beerdigt wurden und mehrere Tafeln, die wir durchschauen mussten mit Hunderten von Namen. Als wir dann das Grab von Eamon de Valera erreichten, dämmerte es bereits und ich musste schon dauernd auf die Uhr gucken, damit ich meinen späteren Termin noch erreichen würde bei Zeit. Er war Sohn eines Kubaners, also Valera war Sohn eines Kubaners und einer Irin. Trotzdem wurde er zu einer der wichtigsten Führer in der irischen Unabhängigkeit, im irischen Unabhängigkeitskrieg. Er wurde einer der ersten Präsidenten der jungen Republik.
Who's buried under the tower behind me here. And why did Daniel found a cemetery? Well, at that time Catholics had no cemeteries of their own, and they were the majority population of the country. Now, they could be buried in a Protestant cemetery, but they could not have a full Catholic funeral service because of very severe penal laws that had been passed against Catholics. So, when there was an easing out of those laws, Daniel grabbed the opportunity to set up a cemetery, and Daniel wanted one that would be inclusive. He wanted one for people of all religions and no religion. So we have 26 different religions buried here at Glasnevin Cemetery, and we've lots of people with no religion at all. It began as 9 acres, and today we have 124 acres. We've the land that's here and the land behind the red brick houses on the far side of the road. And it began during the reign of Queen Victoria, and it developed as a garden cemetery. Now, a garden cemetery was a place where people came not just to bury their dead, they came just like yourselves to enjoy a morning or afternoon stroll, admiring the sculpture, the architecture, and all the beautiful landscaping that we have around the cemetery. Back in Victorian times, people would pack a picnic basket on a Sunday morning and come out here to Glasnevin for an afternoon picnic, enjoying all the things I've just said. They don't have to do it anymore. We've our own restaurant and cafe. I have to do a bit of marketing, you see. Okay, so we're going to go over here to the grave of Roger. Okay, so this is the grave of Roger Casement. Now, Roger, he was born here in Santa Cove in Dublin in 1864, and on his father's side he was of Protestant Ulster stock from the north of Ireland. And in his early life he worked for the British Consular Service. He served in places like West Africa, that part of West Africa that was a possession of Leopold II of Belgium at the time. He worked among the Putumayo Indians of a remote Amazonian region in South America. And while working there, he saw some of the most horrific human rights abuses against the indigenous people who were working in the rubber industry. Roger investigated and reported on these abuses. Roger won international respect, and George V of England was so pleased with him and so impressed and all of that, that he knighted him and he became Sir Roger Casement. But Roger was basically a nationalist at heart. He had seen so much injustice abroad, he thought about the injustices here in Ireland. So 2 years after being knighted, Roger was back here. He was helping to found and join an organisation called the Volunteers. And when World War I broke out, Roger was in Germany and he was looking for help for an Irish rising. He was hoping, he did not get what he went out looking for. He was hoping that Irishmen who had been taken prisoner of war by the Germans, that they would now come back and fight in the rising and train others into fight. Well, many of those men had volunteered to fight with England in her war. They weren't now too happy about coming back and fighting against her. So the Irish Brigade that he hoped to get did not materialise. Instead, he got a small quantity of arms and ammunition, which came back on board a trawler called the Aude to Tralee Bay, down in the southwest of Ireland. The Royal Navy knew the trawler was on its way, so they intercepted it. And the German captain, Captain Spindler, rather than let the arms and ammunition into the hands of the British, he destroyed the boat. And all the arms and ammunition for the 1916 rising ended up at the bottom of the sea. There's still lots of it down there. They took up the anchors and restored them. Roger himself, he came back separately on board a submarine to Bannostrand, also down in Kerry. He was on his way back to say, don't go ahead with the rising, you do not have what you require. He was picked up by the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force of the day. They searched him and they found a Berlin rail ticket in his pocket. So that gave the game away. He ended up in the Old Bailey in London. He was tried for treason. He was found guilty of high treason. And Roger was executed on the 3rd of August, 1916. Before his execution, Roger said, don't bury me here in this terrible place, referring to Pentonville Prison. Bring me back and bury me at Murlock Bay along the North Antrim coast, a beautiful place that he had fond childhood memories of. He was orphaned at 13 years of age. He was reared by his relatives in Ulster. He fell in love with the glens of Antrim and all of the surrounding area, and that's where Roger wanted to be buried. It did not happen. They buried him at Pentonville Prison in England for 49 years. And then 1 year before the 50th anniversary of the 1916 rising, his remains were released. There was a state funeral and Roger was buried here at Glasnevin Cemetery. And Eamon de Valera, the only surviving leader from the 1916 rising, who played a huge part in getting Roger's remains back here to Ireland, he gave the oration here at the graveside. The reasons he never went back to where he requested, well, one of the reasons was that his remains were released on condition he be buried in the south of Ireland because the troubles were beginning in the north of Ireland. But leave all of that aside. His sister Agnes, in 1925, 9 years after his execution, she came here to Glasnevin Cemetery, and this is the grave that Agnes picked out as the grave where Roger was to be buried. And then a lawyer in the 1950s purchased the grave on her behalf. Roger is the only one of the 16 executed leaders at the end of the 1916 rising to be buried here at Glasnevin Cemetery. All the others are buried at Arbour Hill Military Cemetery further over the city, and Thomas Kent is buried down in Cork. So we are very happy to have Roger here at Glasnevin Cemetery. And you'll also notice his title is gone. His title was stripped from him. And I don't really think that would have bothered Roger all that much. I don't think he was too happy about getting the title in the first place. So that is one of the graves associated with the 1916 rising, which was a military failure. But the spirit would live on into our War of Independence. And on the tour, as we go around, I will mention other graves that are associated with the War of Independence, which began in 1919. But now I'm going to go back in history. I'm going to go back to somebody, a man who wanted to use peaceful means. He wasn't looking actually for a republic. He was looking for a measure of independence. He was looking to get our parliament back that we lost by an act of union in 1800. So I'll take you now to the grave of Daniel O'Connell, the founder of the cemetery. The very first suspension bridge that they ever built, and they built it in 1880. They called it the Daniel O'Connell Bridge. So this man, who's known around the world, was born down near Cahersiveen in Kerry in 1775. He was born into a Catholic landowning family. Very few Catholics owned land at the time. They had been dispossessed of their land. He did well, and Daniel won the day. Daniel grew up to be a politician. He was the first political figure in Ireland to gather behind him a mass movement of the ordinary people in peaceful protest. Gandhi, Martin Luther King copied what Daniel O'Connell did. He empowered people who had been disempowered. If you joined his Catholic Association for 1 penny a month, and that meant poor people could join it, you would experience what a democratic movement was like. If Daniel O'Connell were alive today, he'd be all over our television screens, because today he'd be regarded as a human rights activist. He campaigned for the abolition of slavery, the independence of Poland, and the emancipation of the Jewish people. He was so well known that significant people around the world, including kings and princes, wrote to Daniel O'Connell requesting his autograph. And Daniel gave it if they ruled their country fairly, but if they didn't, Daniel refused his autograph. The poor old Tsar of Russia at that time was really anxious to get Daniel's autograph and could not get it because there was serfdom in Russia. Daniel became so popular that in 1831, Belgium got its independence. They were thinking of restoring the monarchy. And would you believe, 3 Belgian parliamentarians put Daniel O'Connell's name forward as the future king of Belgium, and Daniel refused the invitation. In Ireland, we called him the Liberator, because he was the man who by peaceful means gained Catholic emancipation in 1829. Now, Irish Catholics and English Catholics, if elected to the Parliament in Westminster, they could now take their seats. And Daniel himself would sit in Parliament as an MP for Clare. He then tried to get back the Parliament that we lost by the Act of Union of 1800 and caused us to be directly ruled from Westminster. He tried to do that by peaceful means, and he was unsuccessful. And then along came the Great Famine of 1845. And the one man who might have been able to do something had he lived a little bit longer was Daniel O'Connell. You know, on his very last day in Westminster, he was the saddest and sorriest sight. On that day he was so unwell, he was barely able to stand. And there he was once more pleading with the House of Commons to do something about the famine victims. And on that day he said, if you do nothing, 2 million Irish people will die. His plea fell on deaf ears. Well, we all know 1 million died and 2 million emigrated. Daniel was dying. His doctor told him to go on a holiday to the sun. He went on a pilgrimage to Rome to see the Pope and died on his way at Genoa. Now, when he died, they brought his remains back and they buried him way down at the end of the cemetery. While Glasnevin, which is a charity, they had to fundraise. They had to get an architect, builders and designers and build a monument that they felt was fitting for the man called the Liberator. And that was all complete by 1869. And in 1869, they brought Daniel's remains up and placed them in the crypt. That tower is 55 metres high. It had a stairs that went to the top with a magnificent view from the top. And in 1971, when there was a lot of trouble going on in the north of Ireland, a bomb was placed in the base of that tower and it blew the stairs out. And we were without the stairs for 45 years. And last year, Glasnevin restored the stairs. Now people are climbing it every day between 10 and 4:30. And there is an exhibition on the various balconies on the way up, and there's 198 steps to the top and a wonderful view when you get there. And no damage to Daniel's tomb. I'm going to bring you down and show you that. But before I bring you down, I would like to point out that Daniel O'Connell's two greatest campaigners right throughout his political career were two Protestant men. His right-hand man was a Protestant man, Tom Steele from Enniston, County Clare, and that is why he's buried to the right of the top step. And see the white marble monument over there with the head and shoulders of the man on the top? Well, that is Sir John Gray from County Mayo, a Protestant man, huge campaigner for Daniel, spent time in prison with Daniel, and the man responsible for the placing of that monument to Daniel O'Connell, which is in our main thoroughfare in Dublin, O'Connell Street, in O'Connell Street. Okay, I'm going to bring you down and I'm going to show you that I brought in here on a tour a number of years ago was actually Yoko Ono. She was on her way to Dublin Airport and she suddenly realised that this was the O'Connell Tower and this is where Daniel O'Connell was buried. And she said that she had huge admiration for him because he was a peace activist and she would regard herself as a peace activist. And she also spent some time, it was just she was on her own with her sort of security and all of that when she visited, but she spent some time sort of just with Daniel on her own there meditating and all of that, and she loved her trip to Glasnevin Cemetery. I will later on tell you about some of the other interesting people who came here on a trip to Glasnevin as well, like I'll show you the grave that Rod Stewart visited twice, and I'll also show you the avenue that Ariana Grande had her photograph taken on when she requested a tour of Glasnevin. And that's where the bomb was placed that blew the stairs out. Now, after the bomb, Glasnevin immediately repaired the crack in the tower, and then what they did was they blocked up the entrance. And nobody came in here from 1971 to 1991. It was closed for 20 years. Now, during those 20 years, what actually happened was that due to dampness and all of that, all the plaster began to fall off the ceiling and off the walls. So when they opened it after the 20 years, it was quite a mess, you know, you can imagine. And as well as that, they hadn't blocked off the windows in the tower because there's 11 people buried in here, and they wanted the air to circulate, so there was 20 years of birds in here as well. But Glasnevin did a genuine restoration. They put back on all of these beautiful Celtic romantic designs that had been on the ceiling. They studied the paint and the brush strokes and all of that, so it is a genuine restoration. They put back on the design that's here on the border, and that is from the Book of Durrow and the Book of Kells. And of course, as you know, the Book of Kells is one of the most famous manuscripts, you know, in the world. All the writing that you see on the walls are all the important events and dates in Daniel O'Connell's life. Like when he got Catholic emancipation, when he became the first Catholic Lord Mayor of Dublin in 100 years, and of course when he died in 1847. And on this wall here, we have what Daniel O'Connell is supposed to have said as he lay on his deathbed in Italy. He is supposed to have said, "My body to Ireland, my heart to Rome, and my soul to heaven." He wanted to be in 3 different places at the one time. Well, he was raving a little bit when he said all of that. But they took him literally, removed his heart, placed it in a casket and buried it in the Irish College in Rome, where Irishmen trained to be priests. And all of that happened in 1847, and that was perfect. And then, 50 years later, just around 1900, the Irish College was selling out. The Bank of Italy next door was buying over the Irish College. The priests went to look for Daniel's casket and they couldn't find it. So we don't know what happened. We don't know was it stolen, and we don't know. It could be lying in the vault of an Italian bank among all the other treasures. But if there's nothing engraved on it to indicate a link to Daniel O'Connell, well then who knows whose casket it is. But his remains are certainly here in the coffin. Now, the coffin is enormous. It's 9 foot long, it's 4 foot wide, It's 3.8 feet in depth. There is absolutely no way Daniel O'Connell was 9 foot tall. Why did he put him in such a large coffin? Well, the whole idea was to make him look like a king. Even the newspapers, the days after the funeral, had all about the coffin fit for a king, and that was the whole idea. The Emperor of Brazil came here in the 19th century. He was so impressed by what he saw. He actually got his men to go up around the tower, the grassy area around the tower. He got them to pick all the daisies that were growing on that day and bring them all back to Brazil, because he too felt he was in the presence of a monarch. This is black Kilkenny marble. And Kilkenny marble, black Kilkenny marble, was usually just put on the tombs of very important people. It's sitting on sandstone, which is beautifully carved. And then you can look through the openings or the trefoil. See the openings along the side there? And you'll see Daniel's coffin. Now, you don't have to, but they say it's good luck to touch his coffin. But that's up to you. Make sure your hand comes out once you're put it in there, right? Up here we have the O'Connell crest, family crest. 2 Gaelic words, Keel meaning wisdom and North meaning strength. And in the porchway out there, we've 2 dogs' kennels, and they were built into the monument to house the Irish wolfhounds that were to be placed in there to mind and protect Daniel O'Connell's remains. Now that was truly making Daniel like a monarch. And in here we have a small family vault. And in here we have 10 of Daniel O'Connell's family. We have 3 of his sons, 3 of his daughters, 3 of his grandchildren, and we have his great-grandson, and that is the top coffin, the one on the top. All of those coffins have airtight lead boxes inside. No question about it. If we opened any one of those, we would see our Daniels, we would see hair, skin, bones and clothes, even though some of them died more than 100 years ago. But if they opened them, I'd be out of here immediately, because the diseases they died from would be contained there also. His wife is not buried here. Well, she's buried in the most beautiful place. She's buried on an island down near the family home in Kerry. You actually have to wait for the tide to go out to reach the island. She died 11 years before him, and that's where they buried her. And that is where Daniel would have been buried when he died, but Glasnevin Cementery asked permission to bury him here, because he founded the cemetery, it was his cemetery.
Which island is that?
Pardon?
Which island?
That's Abbey Island, it's a tiny one. It's like... Yeah, like, I want to tell you, be careful. When I was down in Kerry, I was going out to see the island, and of course, I went off walking out, and unfortunately, a group of fishermen on the way in met me, and they said to me, whatever you do, don't go out there, you'll be out there for the entire night, and you won't get back in, because the tide, is coming in, and that, but it's a beautiful, beautiful place. They were also grown in the cemetery, so that the farmers, out there, that was all a farming area, would not let their animals into the cemetery once they knew the yew trees were there with the red berries. And as I said, this is the avenue that Ariana Grande had her photograph taken on, and 2 days later she was in Manchester and that terrible disaster. Over there now, I have to be, because there is a funeral there now, so I have to be sort of careful. But over here is our famine cross. Look, see that cross there? And that, and see that cross there? That cross is remembering the more than 22,000 famine victims who are buried here at Glasnevin Cemetery. They came from the countryside into Dublin in search of food and shelter, many of them hoping to get a boat out of Dublin to Liverpool and then to some other part of the world. Many of them never made it. They ended up in workhouses, they ended up in fever hospitals and famine sheds, and many of them buried here at Glasnevin Cemetery. We unveiled that cross to their memory in 2016, and on that day 51 ambassadors from 51 countries around the world placed a wreath at the base of that cross. And if you ever go to Canada, to Gross Island, Canada, look for the Celtic cross, like a Celtic like that stands high in a cliff. It looks towards, it's pointing towards the sea, it's facing towards the sea and facing towards Ireland. And on the base of that cross is a tribute to the thousands of famine victims, you know, who lost their lives, many of them on the way over and on arrival, you know what I mean, in Canada. Okay, so we'll go down this way. By the way, I'm going to stand here and ask you, by the way, look at that real tall tree. Look at the huge tree over there. See what's in the tree. What do you think they are? What would you say? Those they're like...
Nests.
You say nests.
Yeah.
Nests.
Same.
Well, do you know what it is?
I don't know the English name.
Well, it's actually mistletoe.
Yeah.
Oh. It's actually mistletoe that's growing in the trees. I thought I pointed out to you because it's coming up to Christmas now and the mistletoe. So that's in the Botanical Gardens, our neighbour. Our neighbour is... So you could go in there and stand under that tree and have your photograph taken, put it up and it'd go viral. Viral. These are all for the cremated ashes. Look at the urns going to the earth. And cremation is now becoming very popular. And more, I'm just going to go in here for a minute, and more than 60% of the funerals coming into Glasnevin every day now. So this here is, see the circle here, this is the cholera pit at Glasnevin Cemetery, and cholera hit Dublin 2 years after the worst year of the Irish famine, and there are a large number of people who died from cholera in that year buried here in this pit. But look who's buried in the pit, our great statesman Charles Stewart Parnell. Did you ever hear from him? No. Charles Stewart Parnell. Well, one end of O'Connell Street is, you have Daniel O'Connell's monument, and if you walk down O'Connell Street to the other end, you have a monument to Charles Stewart Parnell. Now, Parnell was born into a Protestant landowning family down at Avondale in Wicklow. He was 1 year old and learning to walk when Daniel O'Connell died. And 29 years later, he was elected a Member of Parliament for Meath, and he walked onto the stage that Daniel O'Connell had vacated or left. And the first issue that Parnell dealt with was that of the tenant farmers, who had no security on their land, were rack rented and evicted. No hope of ever owning the land that they worked on. He became president of the Land League, and in time a series of land acts would pass through the Parliament in Westminster, which would improve the situation of the tenant farmer. And they would eventually get loans of money from the British government to buy the land that they were actually working on. He's also the man who wanted to achieve what Daniel O'Connell failed to achieve, and that is he wanted to get the Parliament back. He wanted to get what we call home rule. He took a very different method to Daniel O'Connell. He established a tightly knit parliamentary party in Westminster, and he was head of that party. He was, by the way, the man who introduced the whip into Parliament. He was also the man who used obstructionist tactics in Parliament to try and get the British Parliament to listen to what he had to say. And that was even brought up recently in all the Brexit discussions that were going on. Anyway, his party would side with whichever of the main parties in Westminster would be prepared to introduce a Home Rule Bill for Ireland. And that turned out to be Gladstone and the Liberals. Very sadly, he did not live to see the third Home Rule Bill reach the statute book in 1914, but he did see the first Home Rule Bill introduced into Westminster, and he saw it thrown out. He was dead when the third Home Rule Bill reached the statute book. But 1914 was the year World War I broke out. The bill was placed on the shelf to be implemented when the war was over. And during those 4 years, the Irish nationalists, who were not interested in home rule but wanted an Irish republic, they staged the 1916 Rising, and 16 executed at the end of it, and the whole political landscape changed. He was the man who overcame many difficulties. He became known as the uncrowned King of Ireland. Daniel the Liberator, he's the uncrowned King of Ireland. There was one difficulty that he failed to overcome, and that is when it became public that he was having a relationship with a married woman called Catherine O'Shea, whose husband was a member of his parliamentary party. That relationship was going on for donkey's years. Captain O'Shea knew all about it. He said nothing because he was hoping to benefit from a will that Catherine's aunt would make when she died, and she was a very wealthy woman, and that he would get some of that money. Well, when that didn't happen, he blew the whole story open. And you must remember, these were Victorian times. And the first thing that happened was Gladstone asked Parnell to step down from leadership of the party. He was a proud man. He refused to do so. The Catholic Church, they really liked Parnell, but it was a moral issue for them, and they weren't going to condone the relationship with the married woman. And the majority of Parnell's followers were actually Catholics. So they denounced Parnell. And then the worst thing that could ever happen for Parnell happened. His tightly knit parliamentary party split in two, and the majority of his party went against him. Catherine got a divorce. He married Catherine. 5 months after the marriage, at the age of 45, he died in their home in Brighton in England. And when news of his death reached Dublin, his supporters rushed up here to Glasnevin to find a place to bury him. They went all around the cemetery, and his supporters chose the cholera pit to bury their uncrowned king in. And there's 3 reasons why they chose it. The first reason was, Parnell once said, "Bury me among the poor." And this was part of the poor ground at Glasnevin Cemetery. The second reason they chose it, they knew the anti-Parnellites, who were so anti-Parnell, would never interfere with his grave once it was the cholera pit. And the third reason was, they wanted their uncrowned king to have a circle, the way Daniel the Liberator has a circle on the far side of the church. It was a mixture of all 3. But Charles Stewart Parnell had the biggest ever funeral right into Glasnevin Cemetery. He died on the 6th of October 1891. He was to be buried here on the 11th of October 1891. Well, and he was to be buried at 12 noon. Well, there were so many people out in the streets of Dublin wanting to show Parnell their last respects that it was 6:30 in the evening, 6.5 hours later, when his funeral reached the gate. That's just over there. He was buried here by moonlight. And there was a woman named Maud Gonne, the woman that our famous poet William Butler Yeats absolutely adored. Maud Gonne was here. And she recorded in her diary what happened. And she said that as Parnell's coffin went down into the earth, a flash of light from the heavens came down over his coffin. Now, some people said that was Maud. She was an actress. She was very dramatic. But Dunsink Observatory is just 2 miles out the road, and it recorded that at that precise moment on that night, a meteorite hit the earth. So that is what the people saw, the light from that. And the people lingered on here right into the night time. And as they were going, they went to the trees, they went to the walls, they took the ivy off the trees and the walls, they placed it in their buttonholes to prove that they had supported Charles Stewart Parnell to the bitter end. So as a result, the day he died, the 6th of October, is known as Ivy Day. And we have the ivy. Look at Look at it's here on the railings. We have it the whole way around the railings. And you see that chunk of that is a chunk of granite, because he came from County Wicklow, and granite is the main rock in County Wicklow. And look at his name is on it there, Parnell. Okay? So I'm going to bring you up this way. Now I just want you to remind you, in case you want to get a photograph, you said you come from Zurich. That's where James Joyce is buried. Mm-hmm. Did you know of James Joyce? No? No, that's okay.
I don't know his graveyard.
No, that's fine. He was one of our famous writers. So, no, it's just that if you wanted James Joyce's parents, he's buried in Zurich. His parents are buried just over there. If you wanted a photograph of that place. Mm-hmm. But, no, I just thought. And after the Battle of Gonchi, they actually built a cross. From wood, they found scraps of wood on the earth to their dead comrades. They placed that cross on farmland outside Gonchi. It was eventually brought back to the War Memorial Gardens here at Island Bridge. A cast was taken from that cross, and this cross was made. But the 16th Irish Division fought side by side with the 36th Ulster Division at the Battle of the Somme, and this monument is remembering all of those men. And here on the front of it you have an extract in Irish, English and French from a letter written by Marshal Foch in 1928 to the Times newspaper, thanking the Irishmen for the part they played in the defence of France. And you see this pathway up here, look how uneven it is. Well, the whole idea is that it is to remind people of the brutality of war. But we have 13 World War I chaplains, and one of them is the famous Father Francis Brown. And he was, we associate him with the Titanic photos, but he was also a chaplain in World War I. And he was the man whose uncle was a bishop, and the uncle gave him a gift of a ticket for the Titanic. And he went on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. He went from Southampton in England to Cherbourg in France, and back to Cove here in Cork. And when he got to Cove, now that was the extent of the ticket, it was just for that part of the voyage. And a wealthy American on the ship said that he would pay Father Brown's passage, to America. And when he informed his superior here in Dublin that somebody was prepared to pay the passage for him the rest of the way, his superior said to him, "Get off that boat, get back to your desk and do the work you're meant to do." Now I'm sure he was very, very disappointed, but when that ship hit that iceberg, I'd say he was very, very happy. And it was his photographs that went on the front pages of the newspapers when the ship sank. And of course you do have up in Belfast, isn't that right? You have the Titanic exhibition up there with all of the photographs and everything like that associated with it. He, as I said, he also he was also a chaplain during World War I. And while there, he took very iconic photographs also. And one of the most iconic ones, I think, is the one where you have the German soldier lying in the trenches and you have the Allied soldiers around him and trying to assist him. So that is probably one of his more iconic photographs from World War I. He would eventually come back here, work here in Dublin in the various Jesuit places around Dublin, and be buried here at Glasnevin Cementery. You'll have to, if you want to get a close up of his name, do you? I'll take all of you in with me, because it's very 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 eyes will find the name faster. So we'll go in here. This is very uneven. Keep robbing. See the tower? 7 towers around the walls of Glasnevin Cemetery, and they were to stop grave robbing. It was a terrible problem in the early 19th century. There were 16 medical schools in Dublin, and many of them were anatomy schools, and all of them wanted fresh dead bodies for dissection. Now, the only bodies allowed to go to them are the bodies of executed people. And would you believe we didn't have enough executions? So if you could rob a dead body and sell it to one of those schools, you got the equivalent to 2 months' wages. And better still, if you could export the dead body to Scotland or England, you got the equivalent to 4 months' wages. So lots of Irish dead bodies left Ireland in big boxes with Irish cheese written down the side of the box. They exported them in barrels of whiskey, and when they got to Scotland, they took the body out of the barrel, they sold it to the medical school, and then, do you know what they did with the whiskey? What do you think? Have a guess.
Drinking.
They didn't drink it. They gave it to others to drink. They sold it to the pubs and to the taverns. So now, the majority of you here are visitors down here to the, well...
Camera's all good to go.
So, when did you last look for, or since you came here to Ireland, have you looked for a full-bodied Irish whiskey?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, you won't be doing it after hearing that. Glasnevin says it never happened here. It was in the towers were guards, and they had guns and they had Cuban bloodhounds. And at 5 o'clock in the evening, the cemetery closed. The bloodhounds came out. They wandered all around the cemetery, and that's how Glasnevin kept its cemetery free from grave robbing. But have you ever gone to Shankill Cemetery in Lurgan in County Armagh? Well, if you do, look for the grave of Marjorie McCall. Marjorie died, her husband buried her. The following night, the grave robbers came. They broke into the coffin, they got down into the grave, broke into the coffin, and there they were, sawing away at Marjorie's finger. And the first bit of blood appears. And Marjorie sits up in the coffin. Marjorie gets out of the coffin. She walks the whole way home. She knocks on the hall door, and the husband is in there, and his friends are with him, and they are consoling him. And he says, "Only for I know Marjorie's dead and buried in Shankill Cemetery. I'd swear that was Marjorie knocking on the door." Well, he gets up to open the door. And then I wonder, did he want to see her again or not? Because he gets a heart attack when he opens the door and finds Marjorie's outside the door, and he drops dead.
Alan, if you want to leave.
Marjorie lives on and eventually dies, and Marjorie goes back into the same grave. And on her grave is engraved, Marjorie McCall lived once, buried twice. And I haven't mentioned a woman so far on the tour. So Maud was an English woman who was very wealthy, majestically beautiful. They say she was the most beautiful looking woman in the world. And she became an Irish rebel. And she came here to Ireland hoping to become the Joan of Arc of Ireland. Well, when she got here, she soon realised that women were not welcome into the movements. So she set up her own movement called Irlandinteressierte, Daughters of Ireland. And she set it up on Easter Sunday 1900. Now, that was a nationalist, separatist, feminist, autonomous movement, and it had a newspaper called Ban na Heron. And do you know what they said about that newspaper? They said it was the newspaper that the men bought to find out what way the women were politically thinking. It was actually a hodgepodge of knitting tips, cooking tips, gardening tips, but it was the only newspaper that blatantly stated that there was only one road to independence, and that was through a rising or a rebellion. No other newspaper was quite so blatant. She protested about British monarchs visiting Ireland. She protested about Irish men joining the British Army. She encouraged the buying of Irish products and the speaking of the Irish language. Maud always said, you can wear the fashions of Paris, but make sure you make them out of Irish linen and Irish tweed. And many of her women went on to form Cumann Amon, and 200 were actively involved in the 1916 rising. Now, She had a relationship with a French politician, Lucien Milvoy. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it right or not. She had a relationship with a French politician. That relationship drifted. And then Major McBride, look at the name there, became her knight in shining armour because he fought with the Boers against the British in South Africa. She went out to Paris to receive him back from South Africa. In time they married, and in time the marriage drifted. And Major McBride was one of the 16 executed at the end of the Rising. But before that marriage drifted, they had a son called Sean. And Sean McBride was initially a rebel like his parents. He was Chief of Staff of the IRA in 1936. He left the movement in 1937. He became a lawyer and a politician. And Sean McBride was one of the founders of Amnesty International. He was chairman of Amnesty for 14 years, and he had both the Nobel Peace Prize and the Lenin Peace Prize before he died. He's also the man responsible for the McBride Principles, which was a forerunner to the Northern Ireland Agreement. But we can't leave this grave without remembering our renowned poet William Butler Yeats. He absolutely adored Maud. She was his muse. She inspired the wonderful poetry that he wrote at the time. He proposed marriage to her on 4 occasions, and 4 times Maud said no. And when he couldn't marry the mother, he thought he might marry the daughter she had with the French politician, Isolde. She was in her 20s, and Isolde too said no. But he still went on to be inspired. And if you know that poem, he wishes for the cloths of heaven, where in the last lines he says, I spread my dreams beneath your feet, tread softly, because you tread upon my dreams. He was referring to Maud Gonne. Well, she trashed all over his dreams. And she always said society should thank her for never marrying William Butler Yeats, because he wrote his best poetry when he was pursuing her. And had they married, there might have been no poetry at all. From that to a sad grave down here, the proper pronunciation. And Grace, she was an artist. She fell in love with the poet, the rebel, the signatory of the 1916 proclamation, and the military strategist of the 1916 Rising, and his name was Joseph Mary Plunkett. And when she heard he was going to be executed for his part in the 1916 Rising, she bought a ring in Grafton Street in Dublin. She hurried up to Kilmainham jail, where he was a prisoner, and they got married in the chapel, and 2 guards acted as witnesses. After the marriage, she was sent away. She was called back at 2 a.m. in the morning. She was given 10 minutes with her new husband, surrounded by 15 guards, and sent away again. And Joseph Mary Plunkett was taken out and executed at dawn. Grace was both a wife and a widow in the matter of a couple of hours. She never remarried, and she's buried here with her father-in-law and her mother-in-law. Grace herself would experience life in Kilmainham jail because, like so many of the women, she took the anti-treaty side in the Civil War and was placed in Kilmainham jail because of her anti-treaty activities. And while there, she painted the Madonna and Child on the back wall of her cell. And if you visit Kilmainham jail, you will still be able to see that on the back wall. You'll be actually looking at the restored work done by Thomas Ryan, RHA. She continued her membership of Sinn Féin. She was on the executive of Sinn Féin. She would eventually die alone in a room in South Leinster Street in Dublin in 1956. This is the grave that Rod Stewart has now twice. Come here, let's see, bring it over, let's see it.
It's hard to see him, but it is him.
Oh yeah, that's him. Yeah, very good. That is excellent. That is, oh, that's brilliant. That's only last week.
Last week.
Is it last week or the week before?
Last week. Over for the cup.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, that's Rod there. Look at him. Putting down the flowers. That's his second visit here. Yeah. And his second visit to Kilmainham Jail as well, because he wanted to see the song. But her brother-in-law, her sister Muriel's husband, was executed as well. And then her father, I think, died from the whole thing. And then her sister Muriel, a year after that, drowned out swimming at Skerries. She lost 4 members of her family all to. And what's fascinating about her family is this: the father was a Catholic Unionist, the mother was a Protestant. All the children, women, girls were brought up as a Protestants, and they all became involved in Republican activities. And now some will say the boys were also brought up, but none of the boys became involved. It was actually all the girls on one side of the family. It's amazing, isn't it? You know. Eamon, he was born in, you are particularly interested in this grave, are you? It's on the list that you, yeah. So Eamon, he was born in New York in 1882. I know it looks a bit strange there. See, Eamon, hard to make out, but it's the 14th of the 10th, 1882 that he was born. He was, his father was of Spanish-Cuban. His mother was Irish. And his father died when Eamon was 2 years old, and his father was an artist, and his mother sent him back here to Ireland to be reared by his grandmother. He was a smart young man. He became a mathematics professor, a rebel, a politician and statesman. And 1916, commander in Boland's Mill. At the end of that, he wasn't executed, and some would say it was his American citizenship. But Tom Clark had an American citizenship, and he was executed. I think some historians would say that at that stage the British had begun to realise that they were only creating martyrs by executing these men, and they stopped the executions. And Eamon de Valera was one of the last to surrender. He goes to prison instead. Now, he goes to prison in 1916. And then in 1917, Eamon de Valera gets out of prison. And what happens is, here is the leader who has come out of prison, who has survived and, you know, all of that, and he comes to the forefront of republicanism. He becomes president of Sinn Féin, president of the Volunteers, and he wins an East Clare by-election on a Sinn Féin ticket. 1918, Eamon de Valera has a very successful anti-conscription campaign, because the British have decided they're going to conscript Irishmen, and he is involved in that anti-conscription campaign. Eamon de Valera will end up in prison again in 1918, and this time he's put into prison because he is accused of being part of a German plot to overthrow the British. There was no such plot at all, and many of them ended up in prison as a result of that. Countess Markievicz ended up in prison as a result of that. He's in prison when that very important 1918 election takes place, where Sinn Féin wins 69 Sinn Féiners win 73 seats in the British House of Commons. Eamon de Valera is one of them. He wins 2 seats, but he is in prison. And Sinn Féin, of course, then in 1919 followed through on their abstentionist policy, and they do not take their seats in Westminster. They set up their own Dáil Éireann, and which is regarded as illegal in the eyes of the British. The very day, Eamon de Valera is in prison when all of that happens. When he gets out of prison, he becomes president of that Dáil. The very day the Dáil opened, the first shots of the War of Independence began, and Eamon de Valera would spend 18 months in the United States fundraising and for the Dáil, and also hoping to get Woodrow Wilson to agree with or to recognise an Irish Republic. Woodrow Wilson's relationship with Britain was more important than his relationship with Ireland, so he doesn't give that recognition, but de Valera does well in the fundraising. The very day that Dáil opened, the first shots of the War of Independence began, and that war ended with a truce, and a treaty had to be negotiated. And Eamon de Valera makes the most controversial decision of his entire life when he decides he's not going to go and negotiate that treaty. He asked Austin Stack to go, he said no. He asked Cathal Brugha to go, he said no. It eventually fell to Michael Collins to go. He gave them the power of plenipotentiaries, but told them don't sign anything without referring back to him. Initially they did that, but when they found themselves in a situation with that skillful negotiator Lloyd George standing over them and announcing that if they did not accept the final draft that was on the table, war would break out again. This time it would be a bloodier war. Many of them realised they did not have the resources for a bloodier war, and signed for a 26-county Irish Free State with Dominion status and an oath of allegiance to the British monarch. It was brought back. It was accepted by our Dáil. It was accepted by the people. But there were others who were unhappy, including Eamon de Valera. It led to that civil war. Regardless of the civil war, the Irish Free State was established. And in time, Eamon de Valera will begin to think and realise that he cannot achieve very much unless he gets back into the Dáil, or unless he gets back into the Parliament. And so he's a member of Sinn Féin, and many Sinn Féiners mightn't want to take that oath of allegiance to the British monarch. And he doesn't himself want to take the oath of allegiance to the British monarch. But he knows if he wants to achieve, he has to go back in. So he leaves Sinn Féin, sets up his own political party, Fianna Fáil, takes the oath as an empty formula, and Eamon de Valera is back, with the help of Labour, is back in power in 1932. And when he gets back into power, in a very short space of time, he dismantles that treaty. He changes Ireland to a 26-county Irish Republic. He does not call Ireland a republic, nor does he take Ireland out of the Commonwealth, because he wants to keep the gate open to the north of Ireland. It is J.A. Costello of the Inter-Party Government on a trip to Ottawa in Canada in 1949 declares Ireland a republic. Eamon de Valera shows his unhappiness with that by not attending any of the events associated with it other than the Mass. He's the man who oversaw the writing of our 1937 Constitution. Some would say that was Eamon de Valera's greatest piece of work. It is a constitution that has inspired other constitutions, and it is a constitution that has stood the test of time. It would be a constitution that many women would be unhappy with because of where it placed women in society. He also was a man who was totally opposed to a state religion, but did give a very special place to the Catholic Church in that constitution, and got some criticism because of that. And he's the man who maintained our neutrality in World War II. And maintaining our neutrality was a sure sign of our sovereignty. It may have been an ambiguous neutrality, but we were not combatants. He gave 50 years of his life to the formation of the modern Ireland. He was 3 times Taoiseach. He was twice President of Ireland. He's a man who has been much admired. He's also a man who has had his critics, and he's a man whose leadership has been looked at by others around the world, by people like John F. Kennedy, Nehru and Gandhi, and he is internationally known. And what amazes international visitors to Glasnevin is to find that a man of such political significance, as you said, is buried under such a simple and humble cross. When you look what Daniel's under, and honestly, if you ask Daniel, what did you think of that? What do you think of that tower? Was it big enough for you, Daniel? He'd probably say no. I would have expected one bigger. And if you look at Parnell and the cholera pit, you know, and here's Eamon de Valera, who gave 50 years of his life under a tiny cross. There is an explanation. You'll see here the name Brian. There, where is it there? Brian was his son. He was killed in a horse riding accident in the Phoenix Park when he was 20 years of age. This is where Eamon de Valera bought the grave, and he bought it here because he wanted to bury him in the shadow of the tower, but he also wanted to bury Brian where there were no trees, because it was a branch of a tree that knocked Brian off his horse. And this is the headstone he placed over the grave. A perfect headstone for a man who was only 20 years of age. But as time went on and the family moved on, his wife Sinead, the Irish language teacher, writer of mythological stories for children, the woman who never sought the limelight but won the hearts of so many visiting dignitaries, to Orsa Nuchtron when she was First Lady, when she died, followed by Eamon 7 months later, followed by other members of the family like Rory and Vivian. And Rory, by the way, was called after Roger Casement, because the De Valeras were very close friends of Roger Casement. Sinead De Valera taught Roger so much of his Irish. They were all buried here and they kept the little cross. It's like as if the De Valeras were saying that if that cross was okay for Brian, it was also okay for the man who was twice President of Ireland. And here you have his son, the lawyer, Terry, and his wife. Here you have Eamon de Valera's son, the doctor, Eamon and his wife. And in the last grave down there, you have Emer and her husband. And Emer is the daughter of Eamon de Valera, and also herself and her husband are the parents of one of our TDs today, Eamon O'Queeve. And Maureen de Valera is buried down at Glasnevin Cementery in Galway. She worked for a number of years with Galway University as a lecturer. Okay, so there's James Larkin. I'm running a little bit behind time, but I just there's James Larkin, the Labour leader. He, James Connolly and William O'Brien were the founders of the Labour movement in Ireland, and that was the movement that predated our Civil War politics. And he's the man whose monument you see in O'Connell Street, his hands up in the air. And the reason his hands up in the air are because James Larkin always said the great appear great, because we are on our knees, let us rise up. And he's the man who he was a docker. He actually showed his organisational skills. He came to Belfast to unite the Catholic and Protestant workers in the shipyard strikes. He was too radical for his bosses, and he ends up down here in Dublin. The Dublin he came into was appalling. It had the highest infant mortality rate in Europe, the highest rate of contagious diseases, so many unskilled and so many unemployed, and so many families living in one-roomed tenements. These people could not empower themselves, and he walks among them. He sets up the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. 20,000 join it. They get wage increases, but the employers are unhappy. And 400 employers will eventually come together and lock out those workers and refuse, to those workers who wouldn't leave, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. It leads us into 7 months of lockout, rioting on the streets of Dublin. The Irish Citizen Army is found to protect the workers. It goes on, changes its constitution and fights in the 1916 Rising. His greatest enemy during all of that was William Martin Murphy, who's buried beyond the chapel there in the O'Connell Circle. William Martin Murphy was the capitalist who owned a tramway company, huge investments abroad. William Martin Murphy won the lockout. He did not destroy the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. It is still with us today in the form of SIPTU. And if you look at this little hedge here, if you look at it carefully, you'll see it is not growing to the right, nor is it fully to the centre. This hedge is growing to the left. Look, it's way over the thing. It's not anywhere near it on the other side. It's growing. It doesn't matter how much Glasnevin cut this hedge. It continues to grow to the left. James Larkin, the Labour leader, is still doing a bit of work down there. The white flag of surrender with Patrick Pearse up Moore Street at the end of the 1916 Rising, when he surrendered to General Lowe, and she carried the message of surrender around to the garrisons. They took a photograph of the surrender and they airbrushed Elizabeth out of the photograph. And writers of women's history today will say the reason she was wiped out of the photograph was because that was 1916. Women were looking for the right to vote. It wasn't happening for them. And if women read her story and that she had gone up, negotiated with the British general regarding a surrender, had accompanied Pearse up, had actually carried the message to the garrisons, women would be so irate and the British had a war on hands. They did not have time to be dealing with irate women, so the easiest thing to do was wipe her out of the photograph and wipe women out of history for a period. Okay, here we have the famous grave of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, and this man was born down near Rosscarbery in West Cork in 1831, and as a teenager this man saw the worst of the Irish famine. He buried his father in a shallow famine grave. He would carry those memories with him for the rest of his life. And in his early adult life, he formed the Phoenix Society. It was a cultural movement, but it was also aimed at getting an Irish Republic. And then he and his society joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood, founded by James Stephens, buried over there in the corner. He spent years in English prisons. He experienced terrible hardship. He often had to eat his food from the floor with his hands tied behind his back. And then there was an amnesty for Fenian prisoners, and Jeremiah was given a choice. He was told, spend the rest of your life in an English prison or get out of Ireland. He chose exile, and he and 4 others, one of them being that famous man there, John Devoy from County Kildare, went into exile to the United States on board a boat called the Cuba. They're known as the Cuba 5. He lived his life out there helping the Irish cause, and he eventually died on the 29th of June, look the date, 1915, on Staten Island in New York. Well, when Tom Clark, who was planning the rising, heard he was dead, Tom Clark said, bring his remains home immediately. We will have a massive funeral and we'll whip up enthusiasm for the rising. And Tom Clark asked, he knew his men very well, he asked Patrick Pearse to write the oration and to give the oration. And Patrick Pearse said to him, how far will I go with this? And Tom Clark said, throw caution to the wind, make it as hot as hell. And the day the funeral came, and there were more than 50,000 gathered here. We were experiencing a heat wave. It was the 1st of August 1915, and out of the crowd steps the young man wearing the volunteer uniform, Patrick Pearse, and he gives this oration that's gone down in Irish history as one of the great graveside orations, and ends with those words, but the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. And it goes on to explain that as long as Ireland unfree holds these graves, Ireland at peace will never be. It is that oration that decided that Patrick Pearse would be the commander of the 1916 rising. He came in the gate that day. He was little known. He walked out a leader. And less than 10 months later, the rising is over. And 16 of those men, including Patrick Pearse, are executed. This funeral was a huge propaganda coup for the men who had been planning the rising. And before I bring you to Michael Collins, I want to point out that in here, look at just in there, see where the white rose is another very important woman. And her name was Countess Markievicz. And Countess Markievicz was born into a privileged family, the Gorbooth family of Sligo. She was expected to grow up, be a lady and marry a lord. Well, she married a Polish count, that is, if he was exactly a Polish count. She certainly wasn't expected to be a rebel. She went to Paris to study art. They took a photograph of her in Paris, and there she was, doing all of the things that a lady of her background should not have been doing. She was cycling a bicycle, she was wearing knickerbockers, she was smoking a cigarette. It was only a glimpse of what was on its way. She confided in her diary that nature should provide her with something to live for and something to die for. Well, when she met Bulmer Hobson, he was the man who opened the doors for her, and when she joined Sinn Féin, and he introduced her to the people she needed to know. Together they founded Na Fianna, and they trained and drilled the young boys in the use of arms, and 2 of those young boys would be executed at the end of the rising. She herself was second in command in the College of Surgeons during the 1916 16 rising. At the end of it, she was sentenced to death, but it was commuted on the grounds that she was female. That upset her very badly. She felt she should have been treated the same as the rest of the men. And then Sinn Féin in 1918 would put forward 2 women for election. They put forward Winfrey Carney in Belfast and the Countess down here in Dublin. 17 women stand for election across the British Isles. There is only one elected, and that is the Countess Markievicz. She is the first woman ever elected to the British House of Commons. She doesn't take her seat. She follows through on the Sinn Féin abstentionist policy. And she is actually in Holloway prison in England when she is elected. She's in prison, had been put into prison, accused of being part of that German plot to overthrow the British. And that is where she is when she gets word that she has been elected. She doesn't take her seat in Westminster. She sits in our own Dáil that we have set up, which is illegal in the eyes of the British, and she becomes a minister for Labour. And she was the second woman in Europe to have a ministerial position. She will later on help Eamon de Valera set up Fianna Fáil, and she will die of peritonitis in 1927. She had a huge funeral out here to Glasnevin. The poor of Dublin lined the route out, and the crowds were huge here. And her coffin never came to her grave. It went into number 4 crypt in the O'Connell Circle, and they came back to all the people who were gathered here, and they said, "Sorry, Madame," that's what they called her, "will not be buried today. If you want to go to her funeral, come the whole way back tomorrow, Monday." And when Monday came, only 50% of the people came back. And you know the reason all of that happened? The grave diggers at Glasnevin had become unionised. They were not prepared to dig or fill a grave on a Sunday. So here was this great lady, Minister for Labour, faced with a union problem on the very day of her funeral. I will go around to Michael Collins's grave because I'm afraid you're going to freeze to death. See, this is the final grave on the tour, and see those 2 plots there? See this plot here and that plot there. They're all owned by the Department of Defence. Now, not that plot, the one beyond it is the Congo plot, and that's where Irishmen who lost their lives in peacekeeping duties abroad are buried. Here, members of the Irish Army, when they die, they can be buried here. And here, members of the Free State Army, and that was Michael Collins's army. So here is the commander of the Irish Free State Army, General Michael Collins. And he was born down at Woodfield near Sam's Cross outside Clonakilty in West Cork. And he was born there in 1890. And he was born into a family where his father was a Fenian, and into a community where his school teacher was a Fenian. There is no question about it, but Michael Collins was bred and buttered on all those stories of injustice and failed risings. In a sense, it's not surprising the direction that Michael takes in life. You know, it is reported that when Michael Collins was 6 years old, his father called the entire family together. The father was dying, and he said, "Look after Michael, he will do great things for Ireland." It is also reported that when Michael Collins was 11 years of age, he'd actually read the editorial to Arthur Griffith's publications. And at 16 years of age, Michael Collins was in London working for the Post Office Savings Bank, and that's when his mother dies. It is now that his sister Hanny begins to look after him and to direct him. She encourages him to join different organisations. He joins the GAA, the Gaelic League, and it is that West Cork GAA enthusiast Sam Maguire of the Sam Maguire Cup fame that brings Michael into the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Michael watches, and Michael Collins will go to the supreme position in that organisation. He will also later on join the Irish Volunteers, and he'll go to the top again. He'll become Director of Intelligence and Director of Organisation. He's here in 1916. He's aide-de-camp to Joseph Mary Plunkett in the GPO. At the end of that, he's not seen as a threat They don't execute him, and they don't even send Michael to the prison camps that they send the men they're worried about. If they were worried about you, you ended up in Lewis. Michael Collins will eventually end up in Frongach in Wales. But sending Michael Collins anywhere was like handing on a plate to Michael Collins all the opportunities that Michael wanted. It gave Michael time to think, why is every single rising in Ireland a military failure? He soon began to realise we are never able to dismantle the British intelligence network. That becomes Michael's priority. It gave Michael time to think about warfare. Michael was not at all happy or pleased with the way we fought the 1916 Rising, where we barricaded ourselves into buildings and nearly, you could say, waited to be attacked. He would go for guerrilla warfare. He would have his flying columns. He would be regarded as the father of urban guerrilla warfare. And he also began to assess the men around him and pick out his own intelligence network. During the War of Independence, Michael Collins, with his intelligence network, will take on the might of the British Empire. He had become the most wanted man in the British Empire. There was a price on his head. There was terrible poverty. And Michael Collins sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. And nobody handed Michael Collins, there was terrible poverty, and nobody handed Michael Collins over to get that money. He stood with the very men who searched buildings looking for him. They didn't realise this is the guy we're looking for. He had safe houses in so many places. He had an important contact in all of the important places, like Scotland Yard, the RIC, and his agents were working for him in Dublin Castle. Better still, he had a cousin named Nancy O'Brien. She was a really smart young girl. Her bosses loved her work ethic and they moved her over to work with confidential material. She would spend many of her lunch hours sitting in the bathroom decoding messages that were for Dublin Castle. She was decoding them for Michael, bringing them out under her hat in the evening, transferring them into his socks, and he'd cycle off around Dublin on his big rusty bicycle. Do you know that Michael Collins actually brought his Kerry Blue dog to the dog show? He showed her at the dog show. He won the award at the dog show, and he was given the award by the very people who are connected to the people who are looking for him, and they didn't realise this is the guy we're looking for. So Michael Collins, through his intelligence networking, through his intelligence activity, and through his squad. And I mentioned earlier on, oh no, I didn't actually, that his squad, it was his squad who on that bloody Sunday morning at various locations around Dublin shot dead 14 members of the British Cairo gang who were here to destroy Michael's squad. In the afternoon there was retaliation in Croke Park at the Dublin Tipperary match when Crown forces moved into the stadium shooting into the crowd, and 28 people died on that day. And in time, Michael Collins would make the British government realise that he could make governing Ireland very, very difficult for them. But he was also elected to our Dáil. He was Minister for Home Affairs. He was Minister for Finance. He had a brilliant head for finance. He was the man who helped to raise the money that would allow that Dáil to operate independently. And we're doing so well at the time that the Russian government that just had its Bolshevik revolution applied to our Dáil for a loan, and we're actually able to give them $25,000. Handed over in America, we looked for collateral, and we got 4 of the Russian crown jewels. Given to Harry Boland, Michael's friend at that time in America. They would later be on different sides during the Civil War. Given to Harry Boland in America, he gave them to his mother here in Dublin, and she minded them in the chimney breast of her house, down in a housing estate just down the road. Well, we did get the money back eventually, even though the Russians didn't want to pay the interest at first. And the jewels, we had them valued by Christie's. They weren't worth exactly $25,000. They didn't give us their highest grade jewel, they gave us their lowest grade jewel. But they're back in the museum in Moscow. So this now is the man who's asked to go and negotiate the treaty. Michael doesn't want to do that. In his estimation, he brought them to the table. So why now should he have to sit at the table? Well, as pressure mounted, Michael Collins did what he did all of his short young life. He took up that challenge and he went. And together with the others, he brought back that 26-county Irish Free State with Dominion status, and he described it as a train journey. Michael said, you're on a train going to a destination. Something blocks the railway line. Some people on the train want to know nothing about what has happened. Others want to know everything and do nothing. And then there's the ones that'll get off that train and clear that line so the train can go to its destination. That idea of freedom towards greater freedom. As I said, accepted by the Dáil by a slim majority, accepted by the people, but not everybody was happy. It led to that civil war. And early on in that civil war, down in his own native Cork, in an ambush that only lasted in the region of 15 to 20 minutes, there was only one person killed. And that was Michael Collins. Michael Collins, Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Free State Army or National Army. Michael Collins, Minister for Finance. And Michael Collins, Chairman of the Executive that was set up to bring about the transfer of power from Britain to the Irish Free State. And he was only 31 years of age. His remains were brought here to Dublin on board a boat called the Classic. He lay in state in City Hall. Thousands came to show their respects. And then after that, the funeral mass set out for Glasnevin Cemetery. It went all over the other side of the city out of respect to Michael. And when the first part reached the gate down there, the last part still had not left what we today call O'Connell Street. There were 3 hours of a difference. There was 3 miles of a difference. He was buried here with full military honours. And Richard Mulcahy gave the oration describing Michael as the fallen leader, the hero and the legend. 13 tenders carried all of the flowers behind his coffin and 17 bands played the Dead March. There was one flower on top of his coffin, placed there by his fiancée, Kitty Kernan. And she went on and married Major Cronin of the Irish Free State Army, and she called one of her children Michael Collins. And when she told her husband that when she died she wanted to be buried in here, but he couldn't get a grave in here for it's all owned by the Department of Defence. She's buried over there, and this is the most visited grave in Glasnevin Cemetery. It always has flowers, and Glasnevin put no flowers whatsoever on any graves throughout the cemetery, and they are placed here by well-wishers, by family, by different organisations that like to remember Michael. And then you have the mysterious people like Veronique, the art historian from Paris, who works for the d'Orsay Museum in Paris, read Michael's story, fell madly in love with him although he's dead, comes here 6 times a year and places the flowers on his grave, goes off down to West Cork, visits all the sites associated with Michael, but she has a competitor. Since his birthday in 2014, there is somebody else using Interflora, ordering flowers for Michael's grave, having notes written for Michael's grave, saying things to Michael, see the notes there? Saying things to Michael like, Michael, what might have been, signing off as the Yank, and always ensuring that the United States flag is in with the flowers. And because it is the most visited grave in Glasnevin, and there was land available there with nobody buried there, when Glasnevin decided 10 years next year, to build a museum, they built it beside Michael Collins's grave. And I'm just going to show you where Kitty is, and you're finished then. So if we go, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. See the 2 little green bushes and the grey headstone? That's where Kitty is buried. She's buried there with her husband. She's buried with her son. She's buried with her grandson. And you know the son she called Michael Collins Cronin. He's would you believe he's alive and well? No, I don't know him, but he's alive and well. But if you ever saw the film Michael Collins, Julia Roberts plays the part of Kitty, and the guy who plays the part of Michael, Liam Neeson, played the part of Michael Collins in the film. And do you know, did you ever see that film?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you know the part in the film where the guy goes into the dark room and Julia Roberts is asleep in the bed? He opens the curtains to let the light in to tell Kitty the news that Michael is dead. Well, the actor is Ian Hart, and he's playing the part of Joseph O'Reilly, Michael Collins's bodyguard. And Joseph is buried just there. Look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See the 5th grave in? That's where he buried. That is your tour. I hope you enjoyed some aspects of it.
Nun hoffe ich, dass dir diese beiden Episoden über den Glasnevin Cementery gefallen haben. Noch ein großes Shoutout an Anne Kilcoyne und Brigit. Zum Abschluss noch unseren Podcast-Werbeblock. Und zwar, wie immer, wisst ihr ja, die Shownotes findet ihr auf unserer Website erlebnisirland.eu. Wenn ihr keine Folge verpassen wollt, dann abonniert unseren Podcast auf iTunes, Spotify, Deezer, wo ihr ihn überall findet. Denkt dran, vielleicht kennt ihr ja jemand, der noch an Irland und am Reisen interessiert ist, dann teilt doch einfach unseren Podcast, sagt ihm, wie toll euch dieser Podcast gefallen hat, was ihr alles erfahren habt. Gebt uns eine gute Wertung oder einen guten, schönen Kommentar. Wenn wir irgendein Thema für euch mal aufarbeiten sollen, bringen sollen, ein Interview mit jemand machen, was euch interessieren würde, dann gebt uns einfach Bescheid, schreibt uns per Messenger, WhatsApp, E-Mail oder in den Kommentaren einfach. Wir werden das dann aufnehmen, wir werden es durchschauen und dann gegebenenfalls eine entsprechende Episode für dich produzieren. Ansonsten wünsche ich dir einen schönen Tag. Danke, dass du dir die Zeit genommen hast, mit uns nach Irland auf die grüne Insel zu reisen. Leider diesmal nur virtuell und auf die Ohren zum Hören. Bleib daheim, stay safe. Wir produzieren weitere Folgen für dich. Bis später, dein Chris.